saying time is relative does nothing to say that the days in Genesis are anything other than ordinary 24-hour days. We've all debated with old earth creationists. I mean, the debates has happened, dozens and dozens of times on Yom. We know that Yom has more than one meaning, but context determines the meaning. And from my understanding, Yom modified by a number in the Old Testament always means a literal day. I've seen one, maybe two cases that old earth creationists like Hugh Ross have brought up, and we could engage those if necessary. But even those, I think, can be interpreted as a literal day. And it's very similar to the word day in English and how that can have several meanings, right? For example, in my father's day and my grandfather's day, yeah, that would be a period of time. And so that would be a non-literal usage of the word day. But we need to figure out in scripture and in our everyday use of the word day, if based on the context, if it's being used literally or non-literally. But in Genesis, it's clear that we have the word day being used in a literal sense. Yom's very tightly constrained. It either means the light portion of a day or a 24-hour day, but never used as a period of time. I've seen old earth creationists like Hugh Ross point to Genesis 2:4 to say that that's a period of time. There's a couple different positions in the world of young earth creation. I've heard some young earth creationists that say that Genesis 2:4 could be referring to the day in which God created, as in day one, the first day, or just the entire week in general. But that word Genesis 2:4, it's actually a different use of Yom. It's Bayom. And so that could refer to the entire creation week. But you can't just import into that text long periods of time into that word. It is a different word than Yom. And so that would be my thoughts on that. I do have a couple slides I wanted to cover, but we'll get into that a little bit later, because I do want to get some of your initial thoughts there, Ben.
Yeah, my first thought is very similar to what I talked about when we talked about inspiring philosophy in, I think, December. Old earthers love to claim this day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day thing. It refers to the day in Genesis 1 when it clearly does not. As you said, the term day can have different meanings depending on context. And the day is as 1,000 years issue refers to the way day is used in Genesis chapter 2, not Genesis chapter 1. Why? Because when God says to Adam about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And then from Genesis chapter 5, we find that Adam lives 930 years. Or is it 950? I can't remember. I think it's 930. Noah is 950. But the issue refers to the issue of, why did God say that Adam will die in the day that he eats of the fruit of the tree that he wasn't supposed to eat of? Why didn't he die in that day? Why did he die, 900 and some years later? That's what the issue is referring to. So whatever you think about that, that's okay. Okay. That's another issue. That's not about the days in Genesis 1. Moses in Psalm 90 and Peter in 2 Peter 3 are not referring to the days in Genesis 1. Bottom line. Okay. This is a different context. It is a different issue. It has nothing to do with the days of creation.
Yeah, Ben, were you still talking? I'm not sure if your mic cut out or not.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, let me make a point, and you're welcome to push back on it a little bit too. There's arguments that the word day there, referring to Adam, you shall surely die, would actually be both, because he didn't die physically, but spiritually, there are many that would say that he died spiritually in that moment on that day. So I'm not sure that, what do you think about that?
That's one possible interpretation. I've used that interpretation before. I was really just more making the point that old earthers want to apply this to the word day in Genesis 1 when that's not the issue. And Donny was just saying that these words can mean different things in different contexts. And you can't take the way that the word day is used in Genesis 2 and claim that all these arguments are about the word in Genesis 1. It's not the same context. But as to what that really means, I actually think that there's a, and this is, I think, the CMI answer, Creation Ministries or creation.com answer, is that there's a Hebrew phrase in that verse towards the end that is something like mot demote or something, and mot is death. And so the word death, the root word for death, is used twice. And it's in this sort of weird Hebrew construction. I actually did a sort of very introductory Hebrew class last semester, and I happened to find a similar construction in Isaiah chapter 6, where he says, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear. And what my professor at Biola told me, who is an old earther, told the class that the reason this construction denotes not a temporal sense of meaning, but rather a sense of certainty that something will happen. Okay. And so when it says in Genesis 2, I think it's verse 22 or something like that, verse 20, when he says, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. The literal translation there is something like, on the day that you eat of it, dying you shall die. And that there's not a good translation to English here, but essentially what it means is this will certainly happen. And so I think the best way to interpret that verse is to say, on the day that you eat of it, you will begin to die, or you will ensure your eventual death, or something like that. I think that's a perfectly acceptable interpretation of that verse. And so I think the term day there probably does mean when, or in the time that you eat of it, but it's talking about a specific time. When you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will begin to die, and it will certainly happen that you will die because you ate of it. So that's a case of where it's a very difficult thing to translate into English. It's a very strange Hebrew phrase there that, because it's a dead ancient language, it's hard to know exactly what it means. But it's a participle use of a verb, and which you can mean all sorts of different things. And but I think what my professor said is you use context to interpret it. And so the context suggests that God didn't mean that you will die in that exact day physically, that he meant something along the lines of, it is certain that you will die once you eat of it.
Yeah, I think those are some good points. I think with many scriptures that there are dual applications, or a couple possible different ways to look at it that maintain the young earth creation position. And that's one of them. I think it's mot to moot is the Hebrew phrase that, in the day that you eat of the tree, you will begin to die. And I think that is true. You will begin to die physically. I like eschatology. And so I do like to point to that verse as one of the first instances of a dual prophecy where you have an immediate fulfillment. When they ate from that tree, they died spiritually. That's one way you could look at it. But it's a dual prophecy because with almost all prophecies, you got that immediate or near fulfillment, and then you got something in the future that's more dramatic, something more literal. And so in the future, Adam and Eve did die physically. So there's your literal fulfillment, spiritual death followed by eventual physical death. You can look at it that way. I think both in a way work, but certainly not an issue for the young earth creation position. I did have a couple more points I wanted to make on Yom. I noticed a comment here that I thought was funny. It was an old earth creationist, Des Capital, he says, Redeem Zoomer and Inspiring Philosophy are wrong about theistic evolution. Yes, they are. But you guys are wrong about young earth creation. Well, that's an assertion. And we will go over some irrefutable lines because there are so many lines of evidence, gentlemen, as you would, I'm sure, agree. And I know you would, Ben. I've seen you discuss it. There are so many lines of evidence for young earth creation that we could pick from. But we could easily pick 3 or 4 that are just irrefutable, where we've seen all of the possible counters and they don't work, right? C14 in diamonds, helium in zircon crystals, the soft tissue and collagen and red blood cells that we find in dinosaur fossils, genetic degeneration, mutation accumulation, molecular clocks. We can go over so many pieces of evidence that the old earth creationists have attempted, even your best old earth creationists, but they've failed. And so the science really does in many ways preclude the billions of years paradigm. But anyways, we'll get more into that a little bit later when necessary, some of the science. So I have a couple points I want to make on day, but before I do, Sam, I wanted to give you the opportunity if there is anything that you wanted to add here on what's being discussed, brother.
Yeah, I have quite a few points on day also. And so what do you want to do? You want me to make one and then go back and forth, or what? I've got a few, and I also have a nice quote that I found I'd like to share.
Okay, so, you know what? Okay, I'll show my slides then real quick, and then we'll give it to you, and you just take your time, brother. You go over all those points. I know you got some good stuff. I like to leave no stone unturned and show that there's really no other way to interpret this. Now, Ben, on these debates, when it comes to the scriptural positions, theistic evolutionists, day age, obviously we're young earth creationists, other positions within the ancient Near Eastern world, aren't there some like Michael Heiser, Dennis Lamoureux, perhaps John Walton? I know even Inspiring Philosophy, because he looks a lot to those guys, where they would even admit, possibly William Lane Craig, but again, I know you know more about this than I do. Don't some of those teachers reject arguments from Hugh Ross where they try and say, well, day means something other than a 24-hour day? They admit that those arguments don't work. They hold to the 24-hour day reality in Genesis, but they just say that it's temple inauguration. And so it is 24 hours, but it's got a more symbolic or deeper meaning. Would that be accurate, Ben?
Yeah, it's absolutely accurate. So John Walton thinks that the days are literal 24-hour days. They're just separated by long periods of time. William Lane Craig thinks the days are 24 hours, and he has a long section in his book, blanking on the name. This one, In Quest of the Historical Atom. He has a long section just flatly arguing against Hugh Ross by name, that Hugh Ross is wrong about this, and the days mean 24 hours. Now, Craig thinks it's a mythical story, right? That's not historically true. So he can say that without being a young earth creationist. There's lots of different views like that. The days of proclamation view, I think, is similar to Walton's view. But yeah, so they're not all agreed on this.
Right. So in a way, we are countering some of the compromise positions, but there are others that would agree that what you typically get from old earth creationists like Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe, they would even reject that. I heard, and we responded recently, you probably saw it too, Ben, William Lane Craig on the flood, he argued that the flood account in Genesis is clearly global. It's clearly worldwide. It's not local. So he rejects the local flood interpretation or the local flood apologetics from old earth creationists like Reasons to Believe. But he just interprets it in a different way, obviously, because he doesn't think it's compatible with science. He thinks science refutes a worldwide flood. So there are people who are non-young earth creationists who don't buy into these really just, in my opinion, weak apologetics coming from old earth creationists. But anyways, I'll quickly go over this, and then Sam, I'm curious to see your notes, brother. So a very common passage, when you actually dig into the context of it, it leaves no question. Clearly 24-hour days, young earth creation, right in the Bible. Exodus 29 verse 9, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath. You can read it yourself, but verse 11 is what I want to focus on. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. That includes humans, everything, all of life, and rested the seventh day. Okay, the context of verse 11, so looking at the previous verses, right? You always want to look at the previous verses and also the verses after, indicates ordinary days. If this passage really meant anything other than ordinary days, and this is a point I find very interesting, God could have used another word or other phrases too. There's a word olam, which indicates a long period of time. Why didn't he use that word? He didn't. In addition to olam, there are other Hebrew words that could have easily been used to indicate a duration of time longer than 24-hour days. For example, there's Hebrew words and phrases that could mean to the 1,000th generation, thousands of myriads of years. He didn't use those either. The context would also be different if it meant longer periods of time, but it's not. And I think it's just very important to note that God speaks with precision in his word. Believe all the Bible, not just some of it. God was not saying work 6,000 years or work millions of years and then rest one or rest 1,000 years. No, he literally meant work for 6 days, rest one, because that's how he created the heavens and the earth. Very easy, very simple. Context dictates that. The underlying Hebrew dictates that. And there could have been other words and phrases used, but guess what? They weren't. So anyways, Sam, over to you, brother.
Thanks. Yeah, so one thing he said is that he says that a day is defined by the sun, but it's actually a rotation around a point. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a sun. You could imagine removing the sun and placing an apple there. You would still have a day, or there doesn't have to be anything there. You could just have a point. You could remove the apple and have nothing there, and it would be just a rotation around a point. That's actually what defines a day. So you don't need the sun there at all. He goes on to say that because the sun was not visible for the first few days, that therefore the idea of a day is unintelligible. But this is problematic because we believe that Noah wrote, Moses wrote this, and he understood what a day was. And so when it was revealed by God, the way that he created these things, it was revealed to somebody who understood what a day was. So I don't think that point right there is going to work. He says Genesis was not written on the days of creation. Yeah, it was revealed to an author, possibly Moses, who had full comprehension of what a day was. And then the last point would just to be redundant about what you pointed out, and I guess add further context that's what God wrote with his hand and revealed to Moses physically on a tablet. And so that's what they're going to have to argue against here, as if it wasn't bad enough. Do you guys want to add anything to that? And then I do have one more quote.
Ben, anything you want to interact with there, brother?
I think Sam's totally correct about the thing about what he said about the sun. It depends on the rotation of the earth, not the sun, right? And all you need is a fixed point, But one thing I would add is this is the typical Hugh Ross view that the earth, the sun and moon and stars were created before the earth in the Big Bang model. And so this is a problem with Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 has the sun, moon, and stars being created after the earth. And so, people like Hugh Ross and Redeemed Zoomer here want to say that the account in Genesis 1 is fully compatible with the mainstream evolutionary account or cosmological evolutionary account, but it's not. And so they have to engage in these sort of rescue devices to pretend that it does. And the rescue device that Hugh Ross uses is that on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars began to be visible from a hypothetical observer on the surface of the earth. And so the point that I would make simply is that the rest of the passage doesn't make sense if you're trying to think about it from the perspective of a hypothetical earthbound observer. This passage is clearly written from God's point of view. He has a universal vision of the whole universe, the whole world, all at once, and that's how he's talking about what he's doing in creation. He's not talking from the perspective of some hypothetical human before humans were created on the surface of the earth, and the sky is cloudy, so I can't see the sun, moon, and stars. Like that's a rescue device. It's very difficult to interpret the rest of the passage that way. For example, how does a single observer on the surface of the earth know that the waters have been separated from dry ground on the whole earth on day 2, or that God has filled the seas with living creatures? He sees the seas, he sees the land, he sees everything. It's not compatible with Hugh Ross's interpretation of that. But that's because it's a rescue device. It's a way of twisting the text to fit something that you believe for non-textual reasons.